But I protect you against outside enemies. But, I always say we have the outside enemy. So you can say China, you can say Russia, you can say Kim Jong-un, you can say, but that's not, it's going to be fun. If you have a smart president, no problem. It's the enemy from within, all the scum that we have to deal with that hate our country. That's a bigger enemy than China and Russia.
Not long ago, it would have been unthinkable to say this, but that kind of talk from the American president was just no longer very shocking. Political opponents are no longer treated as worthy adversaries with different ideas. They are the enemy within, people who hate our country. Donald Trump may be the most prominent and most caustic voice of this new politics, where outright hatred has replaced healthy disagreement, but he's not the only one practicing it. Trump has gleefully thrown gas on this fire, but he didn't start it, and is in fact as much a consequence as a cause of the strident polarization in our political discourse these days. Jim Peyser says we desperately need to reset the terms of political engagement. Some may know Peyser as the state's longtime Secretary of Education. He served in that role for all 8 years of Charlie Baker's time as governor. But Peyser is also someone with a keen interest in civic life more broadly, and he's plenty worried about its condition. So much so, in fact, that starting a year ago this month, he began writing a series of essays for CommonWealth Beacon on how we might restore civic discourse to something resembling the healthy give and take of serious discussion and debate, and move away from the middle school food fight it has become. Peyser wrote several introductory essays making the case for humility, civility, and, dare we even say, empathy in public discourse. He then went on to write a dozen pieces that are case studies of contentious topics in Massachusetts civic life. For each one, from whether to bring back rent control to whether to offer free community college, he lays out the best case for each side and tries to identify ways they might find common ground or at least a common understanding of the problem at hand. The essays are all available on our website and make for a great primer on important issues facing the state. I'm Michael Jonas, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's weekly podcast on politics, public policy, and civic life in Massachusetts. I sat down with Peyser to talk more about the troubled state of our political discourse and what to do about it. Jim, welcome to the Codcast.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So robust, vigorous debate, we were always taught, is a hallmark of a healthy democracy. But you say there's something fundamentally unhealthy about the way we've been practicing politics these days. What's going on?
Well, robust and vigorous is good, but I think we're at a somewhat different point where we're essentially kind of shouting at each other across the divide using, as I describe in the in the series, bumper stickers, and maybe that's mixing my metaphors there, but in shorthand for kind of what position we're taking, which is essentially crowding out or making it impossible to have an actual conversation around the issues themselves, the problems we're trying to solve, and what some of the solutions might be. And so by doing that, by again sort of shouting at each other and using shorthand and bumper stickers for a substitute for argument, we're drifting into a phase, and I think we may already be there, where we're caricaturing the other side as being either immoral or just plain stupid, which means obviously that we're not having any kind of meaningful engagement across that chasm. And
we didn't get here overnight, and it's certainly not just a phenomenon of sort of politics here in Massachusetts. It's really a national, maybe even global in some ways, development. So I mean, how did we get here in your view? I was looking at some things on polarization, and I found a Pew Center poll that just sort of laid it out in pretty clear terms, polling I think 10,000 Americans, the most extensive look at it, and then I looked at the date on it, and it was 2014. So not to sort of orient everything around Trump, but it's hard to not do that these days. And so it jumped out at me that this is a year or so before he emerged on the scene. So we were already at it.
So on the one hand, everyone blames social media for everything. So I think we should continue to do that. I think social media is certainly part of it. Even before that, cable news and the sort of the bubbles of news broadcasting and the 24/7 news cycle certainly played into that. Things have gotten worse, I think, during COVID. That seemed to kind of accelerate the decline, and Trump's emergence sort of coincides with that really as well. I think it goes back even further. I mean, I think the sort of dynamics of our politics, certainly going back, sort of probably to the 1990s, I would say. I mean, and maybe certainly earlier than that, have been leading us down this path where it's been harder and harder to have conversations across the aisle. I mean, just one personal example, my father was a former congressman from New York, and interestingly enough, he started as a Democrat. Started as a Republican, then became a Democrat. So he sort of reflected a bipartisanship in one person, I suppose. But the relationships that he had with his colleagues during the 1970s when he was in office was, essentially it was a club atmosphere, and that's sort of good and bad, right?
Right.
But nonetheless, the ability he had to have conversations and relationships that were cordial and friendly and open across the aisle is something that you just don't see today and is not even possible. So at some point after that, things began to drift. I think some of that is just a growing ideological bent to the two parties and the way they've been moving apart. Some of it has been the nature of advocacy and activism within each of those sort of halves of the spectrum. But it's some sort of mishmash and combination of all those things. And unfortunately, it's cumulative and it's been accelerating, and here we are.
Yeah. So I guess you would kind of come down in the camp that Trump is more a consequence than a cause of
both.
This.
I mean, I think he's an accelerant,
right.
But he didn't come from nowhere.
Right. And I mean, one thing that I'm, I keep trying to get my head around, and your series, prompted me to keep thinking about it, and some other things that have come out recently on this whole question about polarization and where is the kind of center of gravity is on the one hand, as you say, there has been more polarization. I mean, the Pew poll from more than 10 years ago showed that. I think your points about where the political parties are, underlines that. But at the same time, there's a sense that the noise isn't necessarily reflective of the broader truth of where people stand, and there have been some just in recent weeks efforts to sort of illustrate that. The New York Times had a huge, lengthy editorial about the center is the place to win, and not just again reflecting maybe their own political bent, but they tried to sort of empirically show how you win, especially in districts and places that are a little more swing or balanced in their orientation. And they make a pretty good case for that. And there was a big paper that came out a week or two ago also by some folks, including people from here in Massachusetts, about called Deciding to Win, that, if you want a path to win, it's to sort of see people, see that the center is really the place to go. So I guess those seem to be it seems like both of those things can't be true. Are we more polarized or aren't we?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. I think there is real polarization that's happened. By the same token, I think the center broadly defined, and I think that's center right and center left. And so, in other words, I don't think a pure centrist necessarily is going to win in all places and all races relative to someone who's on more sort of extreme on the opposite side. But nonetheless, I do think that the large majority of people are closer to one another than they think. And that the extent to which they sort of can't talk to each other or see each other or see the other side as the enemy It has to do with sort of some assumptions that are made about who's saying what and what sort of underlies their positions, as opposed to actual engagement in a particular subject on a particular topic. So, some of the polls that I've seen certainly suggest that if somebody, let's say Donald Trump, says something, and somebody else, let's say Joe Biden, says the same thing, that people's opinion about it is very different depending on sort of where they think they sit in the spectrum or who they trust. And I think that's sort of the fundamental problem, is we're a little bit more focused on either the labels or on the signaling of the speaker rather than on the subject and the content itself. And on the one hand, that's always been the case. On the other, and by the same token, I don't think we want to turn this into an entirely technocratic, wonky kind of thing where everyone has to know sort of the deepest level of detail about every single issue. But some, way to get over the labeling, get over the ad hominem parts of the conversation to get to real substance so people can engage. I think that's sort of the goal. And I think if we did that, people would find they had more in common than they thought.
Yeah. And so you did a tremendous amount of work for these pieces. I kept being struck as they rolled in that they were, maybe we don't need to get into the deep depths of these issues, but you did that background work for people who want to know more. What was in your mind when you sort of came up with the idea to do this? Which ended up being, I think, a full dozen pieces, and I don't know, did you learn anything yourself in the process of doing it?
I learned a lot. I didn't actually know too much about any of those issues, other than sort of a passing knowledge, so I probably shouldn't reveal that. I'm not an expert in rent control and supervised injection sites and and even free transit and other whole bunch of things they ended up writing about.
Did you learn something about these issues, or did some things kind of gel in a way?
I think in general what I learned was that there are real problems. And there are different ways of approaching those problems and seeking solutions for them. And I don't want to say they're all plausible, but there's more than one possible answer to each of these questions and problems. And that there's good evidence to support arguments on both sides. So again, the bumper stickers, not so much. That really has more to do with sort of emotion, if you will, than evidence. But when you dig in on these things and try to uncover, okay, well, what is the real problem? What is the evidence about possible solutions or approaches? There are viable and plausible ways to go at this that are not the same. So that's one thing. And it wasn't that I sort of thought I was always right and everyone else was always wrong, but nonetheless, I think it sort of opens your eyes that many of these issues, if not most of them, are about balancing trade-offs as opposed to right and wrong. And then the second piece of it was that when you see that there's some agreement around the problem or to be solved, or whether there can be some agreement around the problem to be solved, there are other ways, which are potentially middle grounds or compromises, but sometimes, as I say in the series, higher ground, where you can sort of step up above your own particular approach or perspective and see that there may be other ways of addressing the problem that can lead to some, if not consensus, at least agreement and understanding that provides a path forward.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk about just a few of the pieces, since you sort of ticked them off, because I was struck in particular by a couple of them that made me wonder, and it sort of goes back to your point about when people hear a quote by, and then if they're told who it's assigned to, their reaction might be different. So you did one piece on the question of should voters have to show ID, and it struck me that we are kind of unusual. I think we're in the minority of states where we don't ask that, and I think people in Massachusetts are very accustomed to that. And I don't know, I think we feel there's a certain indignation, like at the idea that we'd be asked for ID. Yet, you write that it's just common, or it's the practice in many states. There's some pretty good evidence that it doesn't actually suppress vote vote turnout, even among subgroups that people might be concerned about, whether it's low-income people, racial minorities, et cetera. Yet, so it sort of struck me sort of along the lines of who's speaking it, that it's sort of a proxy for other things, right? It's not really about voter ID. It's about, do you sort of believe that people are out to undo democracy, or do you think that we need more?
Yeah,
all those kind of things. And recently the UMass poll came out, and it showed that Massachusetts residents actually support the idea of voter ID. And to this point about complexity, I was trying to reconcile that with the fact that in Maine earlier this month on the ballot there was a question about voter ID, and it was rejected by almost the same 2-1. I think here voters say 2-1 in the polling that they support it. Maine rejected it, but when I looked a little deeper, it was not just voter ID. It was a whole set of things, including like, can you have prepaid postage to return your absentee ballot? And it would eliminate that. It would eliminate presumptions that senior citizens get absentee ballots. I mean, that question did look like a pretty freighted effort to sort of decrease the ease with which people vote. And so, in that case, voters in Maine, took a certain view on it.
And I was up in Maine actually a couple of weeks ago, and most of the yard signs were around the mail-in ballots, not around the IDs, right?
Exactly.
So on this question, I think there's on the pro ID side, as you sort of indicated, there's the reality that it's actually fairly popular, according to the surveys, with most people. In most other states where they have IDs, it's sort of treated as sort of standard operating procedure. It's not a big deal. There's very little evidence to suggest that states that have voter IDs have lower voter turnout. There's a lot of reasons to think that it's, there's less there than meets the eye. But on the other side, what you also see is that it seems to be a problem in search of a solution. A solution in search of a problem. That there's no evidence to suggest that there's a lot of voter fraud, and that somehow if you put in IDs, there's less of it, which then causes people to wonder, well, why are we doing this in the first place? In Massachusetts, when you go to the polls and you maybe you go to the wrong poll, or maybe they can't find you on the registration rolls, you can sign a piece of paper that says, I swear that I'm actually who I say I am, and that I'm registered to vote in this district. And so you vote a conditional ballot, right? So there, even with a no ID, there's a backup system. So all of which is to say, this is a very sort of muddy question, and I don't think it's one that is all that high stakes.
Right.
But it does reflect people's perceptions of the integrity of the system, or their concerns about hidden agendas. So the bumper stickers in this case are either stop the steal or voter suppression, or as Joe Biden said at one point, it's Jim Crow 2.0.
Right.
And so these sort of
gets pretty loaded quickly.
It gets very loaded. And so which side are you on?
Exactly.
Suddenly becomes the question, as opposed to, well, what's actually sort of at stake in this issue from a substantive matter. I think in the piece that I wrote about this, the issue is trying to rebuild trust in the electoral system and trying to increase or simplify voter or improve voter turnout. And there are a variety of different ways you could go about solving that problem, which may or may not have anything to do with voter IDs.
Right. Another one that I was struck by, and it has some sort of real currency today, with things happening on Beacon Hill, was you wrote about whether we should limit the expansion of natural gas connections. And again, that one, I mean, there's just such a clear kind of which side are you on? I mean, should we be getting off of fossil fuels, or should we just, sort of drill baby drill, as you quoted and as Trump loves to invoke? And I guess there's a real question when you sort of drill down on this, if you will, that there can be some agreement that we should be trying to move away from fossil fuels, including natural gas, and still that doesn't necessarily say how you would land on this. And we're now seeing even Governor Healy has seemed to sort of shift a little bit of her take. They're now sort of using the all of the above refrain to say, her approach, which is still very kind of leaning toward renewable energy, but not exclusively. And it's not just that, as you put, there's often trade-offs, I think, in these things. Are we going to go, full bore for, renewables and getting off of fossil fuels, or, do we balance that with energy costs, which have become a huge issue? And it seems like there's a bit of a trade-off there. I mean, I've read some things recently saying it even goes beyond that it gets so complex that shunning more natural gas at times, because there's no real bridge to clean energy, has meant that we've actually used some dirtier ways to generate electricity, namely oil, in the interim. So that's probably not anybody's idea of the right way to go among those who are against more natural gas hookups. But that
I think it touches very directly on one of the themes, which is it's complicated.
Right.
It's complicated from an environmental point of view. It's complicated from an economic point of view. If you try to simplify it, you'll probably end up with the wrong answer, and you'll be misleading people about what the impact will be of any particular choice, one way or the other. I would probably say that in my piece, I was when I talked about common ground or higher ground, I probably was talking about something that's similar to the all of the above strategy. At least as a transitional approach, if not a permanent one. I mean, one of the things just on this issue that people don't fully appreciate all the time is that electricity, which seems like, electric cars and electric homes and, other forms of electricity, that's clean. Of course, where does electricity come from? It comes from power plants, and power plants are, often, if not primarily, driven by natural gas in Massachusetts. And so if you want more electricity, if you want more EVs, if you want more appliances in your home, if you want to cut off, if you want all new home construction to be fully electric, you need to have a source of electricity, which means at the moment anyway, you can't just walk away from natural gas. You have to, continue to figure out how to make it work. And this is where, it gets to the specific question about whether to invest further in natural gas infrastructure. It certainly means you need to do it for safety reasons, but you also probably can make investments that are smart from an efficiency point of view. So not to say that there are no choices or trade-offs here, but a both-and approach at some level, and in some ways that I don't fully understand, can actually improve both the environmental outcomes as well as the economic ones.
But how do we get to a place, if you think that's a wise place to be, where people really buy into that? And I guess I'm thinking that part of what's going on here is, and I think this was written about in this recent report by the kind of center left folks behind Deciding to Win, which are kind of a group calling for sort of more of a big tent Democratic Party, is that voters, they say, have been become really skeptical of the status quo, the establishment, anything that and those sort of seem close to sort of this kind of balance, on the one hand, on the other hand, there's been a let's just burn the thing down kind of view that has taken hold really on both political extremes. And some would say it's it may be a function, a deserved reaction to a feeling that folks in charge have not responsibly been able to manage things, make things work, get things done. So it's sort of a natural response. So, how do we get to a place where kind of a more balanced look, or considering the trade-offs? It's like hard to say, to be an emphatic moderate, or it just sort of cuts against the grain of the moment we're in, I guess.
Well, obviously one thing is organizations like Mass Inc. and CommonWealth Beacon, need to be held up as beacons of places where reasonable, conversations and writing happens, and people need to read more of it and listen to more of it. So there we go. I get a little promotional.
There you go.
Piece there. I don't know if that's going to solve the whole problem.
Don't let me stop you, Jim.
I don't know if that's going to solve the whole problem. But some form of media reform, if you will, I think is going to have to happen at some point. I do think there's some electoral changes that probably should be considered seriously. I mean, I'm intrigued by, I guess, the idea of open primaries as a way of limiting the sort of impact of the extremes of either party in terms of driving the candidates that the general election tends to ultimately get to choose from. I think just looking at the politicians we have now and the messages that they send out, to your point, from both left and right, whether it's again, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, or Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, or whomever you want to name, they all say the system is rigged. And that everything's a fraud. And that's both in terms of the political system and the economic system, and it is leading people with some justification to say, well, I guess they're right. And so some of it has to do with just holding our politicians accountable for not undermining themselves and the system that they serve and the institutions that are part of it. That's easier said than done. I think it's a cultural shift that took us decades to get to, and it's probably going to take us decades to get out of.
Yeah, and I think I think it probably can't go unsaid that that you spent 8 years working for Charlie Baker, who is I was thinking about the right comparison. I don't know if it's the right whale as an endangered species, but a sort of moderate New England Republican certainly is something we don't see much of, and a lot of what you say, I sort of hear echoes of things we heard from him. I mean, did you? And of this chicken and egg, you kind of went into working with Charlie Baker with some alignment of views, but did your time there in state government further reinforce some of these ideas of yours working? As he had to with a Democratic-controlled legislature, and you constantly heard him focusing on how do we get certain things done here.
I mean, the short answer is yes. I mean, it's sort of easy to be bipartisan when you're a minority in a one-party system,
right?
Because you don't have too many choices,
right?
But nonetheless, I think for Charlie Baker, it was an authentic reflection of who he was and is, as opposed to some tactical move in order to sort of survive in a difficult situation. But short answer is yes. I mean, I think, what the other thing that he demonstrated is you can be incredibly popular when you do that. So it's not as if it's seen as being a road to irrelevance. It's actually kind of the opposite. I think we see that in a number of other states where governors are, not in exactly the same model as Charlie Baker, but a similar one where they're seen as sort of the rational, practical, pragmatic center in the midst of sort of political chaos around them. It works pretty well.
That is an interesting point, and it kind of goes back to this sort of idea of some of the pieces that have been circulating lately that have been trying to push back on the idea that we are really such a country of extreme polarization, and that there isn't really kind of more that there really is a center of gravity, and it's somewhere closer to the center, I guess.
And obviously, as has been long the case, the growing number of independents who are not affiliated with either party doesn't mean that independents are all centrists, but they certainly don't necessarily hold allegiance to one party or the other, which reflects a certain bankruptcy of the way the system has evolved, and at least an opportunity to sort of reach new people. I mean, I think I can't remember the Senate candidate in Nebraska who ran as an independent and did very well.
Right.
And he was a populist independent, but in a place like Nebraska where he probably shouldn't have had a chance to get anywhere, he actually came pretty close, and he's probably going to run again, and who knows, he could even win. But it does suggest that there's a lane somewhere politically for people in the right place and the right time to sort of not give in to having to lean so far in one direction or the other in order to ensure that they don't have a primary or that they can win one.
And it might be, I mean, we are always taken with these sort of people that sort of shun the two-party system and go their own way. We've yet to really see that take hold in a broad way. So it still seems for now we're a place where mainly the game is played between these two parties. And you wrote in one of the pieces that the era of big tent parties, that are really kind of laser focused on trying to win elections seems to have been, you wrote, consigned to the dustbin of history. I guess I'd sort of say, well, it seems to be the case, and there are a lot of structural reasons why, like individual political leaders, presidents in recent years have become, the force, not the party itself. But I just do wonder whether, and maybe I'm making too much of the recent sort of rumblings among Democrats of that, and I think there's nothing like being out of power and losing to focus the mind. So I think Democrats at the present time are the ones where you're hearing a lot of discussion about the need for a bigger tent. Now, that's going to be fought out. We're seeing that with, people have tried even from the midterms to say, well, you had Mamdani win in New York, and then you had two pretty moderate women win governorships in Virginia and New Jersey. This is, they all talked about affordability with pretty big differences maybe in how they'd go at it, but it's kind of got the makings of this kind of bigger tent and this idea that, Democrats and any party really needs to look at, the particulars of where they're running. And I don't know if that will get traction. And I would guess if Republicans take a real beating in the midterm elections next year, that will lead to maybe some sort of soul searching or questioning about whether, whether they sort of charge hard right. As that New York Times editorial pointed out, Republicans have, even though they're in charge, they've blown several real opportunities in recent years by nominating really hard right people in winnable, races.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I'm not a pundit in my day job, so I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer this question. But
that's the nature of a pundit, is that everybody's got.
Well,
everyone can be one.
In that case. So you're right that losses tend to cause, introspection and maybe change, but they also those can shift pretty quickly as you get self-satisfied by winning something. The other thing that is, I think, relevant here is which relates to sort of the overall problem of polarization, is that so much of what we talk about is nationalized and nationalized very quickly. So it's very hard for individual candidates within either party to really take significantly different positions from one another. I mean, when you think back to the Democratic Party in the 1950s and 60s, where you had segregationists in the South, aligned to pretty liberal progressives in the North and the West. I mean, that's a bigger tent than anyone on either side is prepared to even consider at this point. And so the quote big tent now is probably is pretty narrow by certainly comparison to that.
The big tent is smaller.
The big tent is and potentially very small. So in other words, if you looked, and I haven't done this myself, but if you looked at the differences between the sort of policy recommendations of the gubernatorial winners in Virginia and New Jersey versus Mamdani in New York, I'm not sure they'd be all that different. The overall messaging and narrative around them is very different, but the substance of their policy positions may not be all that different. And especially when you get into sort of the more cultural issues that have really been, in some ways, the wedge that has driven both the parties apart, but also within the party has driven them sort of to the positions they are now. Again, I don't think it's going to be hard for someone in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party to stray too far from the established dogma. So
is there any hope for us, Jim?
Well, I don't think there's a quick fix or a silver bullet. I think this is going to take time. I do think there are some structural reforms that could probably help. But by the same token, I think it's a cultural shift that's just going to have to happen over time. And there's some efforts underway to try to stimulate some of that, some discussions across difference and across party lines, and those are all good. They're all small scale now, and hopefully they'll get bigger and have bigger impact. But I think it's in some ways it's unfortunately hard to see a path through this other than sort of the day-to-day slog of trying to be more reasonable, both in terms of how we talk about issues, but importantly how we talk to and relate to one another.
All right. Well, that's a reasonable place to stop. And thanks so much, Jim Peyser, for being here on the Codcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Jim Peyser for joining me on the Codcast. I'm Michael Jonas. Our production and theme music is by Charlie Cazella. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this to help others find us. Email us at codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch. We'll see you next week.